Before we get started, I'm going to invite, I'll just acknowledge that I've got two colleagues with me here today. Marg McLaughlin is our communications manager. In a minute, she will do our karakia for us. And Johann Go is our Dr. Johann Go is our Director of Research. He'll be doing the main presentation. May I hand over to you, Marg?
Kia ora, Michelle. Kia ora, everyone. Whakataka te hao. Whakataka te hao ki te uru, whakataka te hao ki te tonga. Kia mā kina ki uta, kia mā taratara ki tai. E hi akai ana te ātakura. Hei tio, hei huka, hei hao hunga. Ti hei Māori ora.
Ngā mihi, Marg. Thank you very much for that. I was meant to be doing, there's some more guests there. That was meant to be my job while you did the karakia, which I forgot to do, sorry. So, as I said, no mai, haere mai, welcome to our session today. It's a session on our regional report, which is a really awesome piece of work which has been derived from our wider State of Volunteering report. The State of Volunteering report is a biannual piece of research, so we do it every 2 years. We survey organisations and we survey volunteers. And we also draw on national population-based data as well around volunteering. So I'm just mentioning the wider State of Volunteering report because the more and better information and data and the breadth of responses that we receive to that report enable us to do regional reports and delve deeper into the what it tells us and create new and better insights for the sector. Very briefly, before I hand over to Dr. Go, I would like to just talk very briefly about Volunteering New Zealand. We are the national peak body for volunteers and volunteering organisations. We have a national membership of about 100 organisations. Sitting under that is around 10,000 community organisations under all of our members. So collectively, we are part of a massive network and we are stronger together. So Volunteering New Zealand's strategic plan has 3 key focuses, and one of them is whakamana, to recognise the value of volunteering in all its forms. So our research, like the State of Volunteering report, regional reports, those sort of activities are some of the things we're doing to whakamana volunteering. Our second focus for our strategic plan is hapai, to advocate for inclusive, diverse and impactful volunteering. So a lot of the things that we do actually fit into multiple areas of our strategic plan. So showcasing best practice volunteerism, the best practice guidelines that we've recently produced, campaigns that champion inclusion and diversity, and wide celebration of volunteering also fit into this prong. The third key area of our strategic plan is arataki, so leading volunteering in New Zealand, and the best practice guidelines also, as I've said, fit into multiple areas, and I would just like to highlight our new best practice guidelines. If you're new to us today or haven't checked them out, they're a really great tool. People seem to be really excited about them and we're getting really great feedback about them. So please, they're very easy to find from our homepage, and there's additional resources and tools to support that sit under the guidelines. The other thing in our arataki space is a challenge to ourselves to uplift rangatahi and youth volunteering, and that's something as a sector I know is a big challenge for many organisations, so we're pleased to have a focus on that as well. So without further ado, again, warm welcome, and very excited to have you here today. Thank you very much, and I will now hand it over to Dr. Go. Thank you for your time, everybody.
Great. Well, kia ora, everyone, and thanks very much for making time to join us. Just a bit about the format. I'm going to spend maybe 15 to 20 minutes talking about some of the findings, but the rest of the time will be interactive. So we'll have some breakout sessions and then also some opportunities to ask me more detailed questions and discussions amongst the group. So it's really a kind of dynamic engagement for me for us to hopefully work through some of these findings together. If you haven't read the document, don't worry. Hopefully we'll get enough of a good idea from this presentation. But of course, I'm only going to give a snippet of what's in that document. So I will also give a link to that report if any of this is interesting to you to explore further. But I guess one thing we could start with is, why bother with this regional report? Just to put this into context, what Michelle said, I've been involved with VNZ for about 5 years, and I've led the past 2 or 3 states of volunteering report. And what really came to light was the view that the volunteering landscape is actually not homogeneous. So when we look at different areas, different regions, we find that actually different people have different challenges, different strengths, and this was not always reflected in a kind of broad general national state of volunteering report. And so this is kind of the rationale we had. We also had a lot of demand from volunteer centres and volunteer involving organisations who said they want to know more about their region and what specifically, for example, is challenging for Southland that might not be the case in Auckland, for example. And this, in a way, leads to the regional report being able to be used as an advocacy tool. Having finer grained data means that you can approach funders in your area. You can think about targeted support in a way that we can't if it's just a general national level. And so this is the kind of framework, I guess, for why we are embarking on this project in the first place. And I also want to thank everyone who participated, because the wide variety, the wide range, thousands of respondents is what made it possible for us to actually delve much deeper into the data than we otherwise could have been able. So in this brief talk, I'm just going to structure it in a number of different ways, right? So firstly, I'm going to talk about how the volunteering experience and landscape looks different across Aotearoa New Zealand. So this is sort of broad, high-level views around how it changes. I'm going to talk about recruitment and retention and how actually recruitment turnover rates differ across the regions. I'm going to talk about how, equality, belonging, diversity, these aspects change across regions. I'm going to have a brief talk about digitalization and uptake of technology, and I'm going to conclude with some recommendations for where we're at and where we're going to look to in the future for this project. But one thing that's quite interesting is when we look at the data for volunteering, we find that volunteers in the South Island of New Zealand tend to rank the state of volunteering higher by a small amount than volunteers in the North Island. So the state of volunteering, for those not familiar with the metric that we use, is a kind of overall barometer question we ask. How do you feel that volunteering is going in New Zealand? How do you think it's supported? Do you think it's going well? And it's meant to be a barometer for how we think volunteering, the health of volunteering. And this ranks slightly higher in the South Island than in the North Island. We also know that there are actually more volunteers in the South Island than the North Island as a proportion of the population. But correlatively, we find that the hours volunteered on average per person per month in the South Island are lower than those volunteered in the North Island. And so there is a kind of paradox here that we've found out. And this report, data, I should say, is actually backed up by the last census and Statistics New Zealand's own findings that show this pattern obtains. And one way to summarize this is to compare the largest urban areas in New Zealand, this is Auckland, Wellington, Christchurch, and other similar sized urban areas, with the smallest regions, which are rural areas. And so we find here that in rates of volunteering, rural areas have a much higher, or slightly, a statistically significant higher rate of volunteering compared to urban major centers. So we're looking at 58.6% of people who volunteer in rural areas compared to 47.5% in the major urban centers. But when we delve further down into this data, and again, this is corroborated by StatsNZ census data, compare, for example, the national average. So on average, a person nationally volunteers for 15.9 hours a month in formal volunteering and 11.8 hours a month in informal volunteering. When we look at the rural setting, we find that the rates of formal volunteering are below the average at about 12.8 hours a month, and also slightly below the average for informal volunteering, about 10 hours a month. When we look at small urban areas, however, so not rural, but small towns, so these are those without a rural delivery postcode, but are considered to be low density and low population numbers, we find that this has the highest rate of volunteering across New Zealand. So 23.7 hours on average for formal volunteering and 13.5 hours for informal volunteering. And just to make clear, formal here means with an organization, and informal is what some people call direct volunteering, volunteering directly for another household without going through an organization. And so this highlights the kind of complexity that we have when we delve deeper into the data. And I'd be happy to discuss this a little bit more about possible reasons why this is the case in the Q&A. One way to break this down is to look at this graph of formal and informal volunteering. And we find, and I don't want to summarize, but when we look at the national average compared to the major urban areas and the rural areas, we find different rates of the percentages who volunteer. So this is no longer hours, but the numbers of those who volunteer. So compare, for example, the national average. We find that in the major urban centers, the numbers of people who volunteer formally is actually much higher than the national average, whereas those who volunteer informally is lower than the national average. The same is not quite, obviously in the rural areas in this graph, it's also slightly higher than average, but much less so than, say, the urban major centers. And there are some theories for why this is so, which I'd be happy to go into a little bit later. But this shows how some of the initial suspicions we have may not always be borne out by the data. Urban centers have higher formal volunteering rates, while rural areas have higher informal volunteering rates. And I think this is what accords with most people's instincts when they think about the nature of the volunteering landscape. One area that's really interesting is to think about recruitment and retention. So both organization reported data and also volunteers' own experiences show that turnover rates, so these are volunteers who leave within 12 months of joining an organization or in the past 12 months, we find that turnover rates are higher in large urban centers compared with smaller towns and rural areas. And in the report, one theory we have for this is that there are far more organizations in large urban centers who, in a way, have to compete against a smaller crew of volunteers. And so it's very easy for volunteers to shop around and to move between organizations. And this has both positives and negatives for organizations. It's an incentive to make sure that we are as inclusive and as, offer as high of a quality of volunteering experience as possible. But it also makes it challenging to retain and compete against other organizations. We also noted that a lot of young volunteers note greater opportunities to volunteer in the large urban centers compared to smaller and more rural areas. So when we look at rates of volunteering amongst those under the age of 25, it's much higher in the larger urban centers than the smaller and more rural areas. And one way to visualize these turnover rates, which is from reported data from the regions, is to look at the percentage of the workforce that has left their organization in the previous 12 months. So in Dunedin, for example, organizations report that about 26.2% of their volunteers left within the past 12 months. Now, this is a very high turnover rate. And one theory, again, that we've tried to explain is this is partly due to the high transient student population in Dunedin, where a lot of volunteering is done short term during the year, perhaps for a few terms, but without long-term commitment. And so this has an effect that Dunedin has a very high supply of student volunteers, but also quite a high turnover rate. And so I guess the turnover rate alone may not signify the full picture of what the volunteering landscape is like in Dunedin. When we look at Christchurch, Auckland, and Wellington, this reflects the similar kind of theory around having higher numbers of volunteering organizations to choose from, and how this affects the kinds of choices people make, shopping around, etc. And we find this somewhat reflected when we look at, say, the West Coast in the South Island, which has the lowest turnover rate of any of the regions that we surveyed. And it shows again that perhaps the idea of this shopping around phenomenon is much harder when there are fewer organizations as a sort of proportion to potential volunteers. When we look further into another theme, which is comparing equality, diversity, and inclusion, we find that organizations in large urban centers are more likely to have equality and diversity policies in place. When we delve further, which is also work from VNZ on recent migrant volunteers, we find that they're more likely to volunteer in the large urban centers and less likely to volunteer in the rural areas. Now, it's worth mentioning that this is partly perhaps because most recent migrants reside in large urban centers, and so it's natural that there are slightly higher rates, but I think it's nevertheless worth pointing out this pattern. When we look at reimbursement rates, which I always include under issues of inclusion, because I think it is about access to volunteering. And so for us, reimbursement is a matter of equality, diversity, and inclusion, because it's about broadening the access to volunteering. But we find that reimbursement rates for volunteer expenses are higher in the large and major urban centers, so such as large cities, and lower when we look at rural areas and smaller urban centers. And one way to visualize this is when we ask organizations and volunteers whether they are compensated, whether they compensate volunteers for their expenses. The national average is about 38.1% of organizations do, rising to about 45.5% in the large urban centers, but dropping to 33.4% in the smaller urban and rural areas. And this again illustrates one aspect of regional difference. So one negative result, which is to say nothing especially significant in terms of a difference, is we find actually that there is no statistically significant relationship between digitization and the use of technology across different regions of New Zealand. So being from a rural area doesn't mean you're less likely to use digitization. Being from an urban area doesn't mean you're more likely to use it either. We find that the main pattern that corresponds to this actually is how large the organization is. So the larger the organization, the more likely they are to be digitized. And this sometimes tracks urban-rural divides, but it's only a contingent statistical relationship rather than something much more robust. And so I guess this is a brief snapshot of some of the core differences amongst the regions, but I guess where does that leave us for the future? Well, one thing we have, I think, to improve on is to better understand the experience of minority volunteers. So in the full report, we look a lot at how experiences of belonging, which is one of the questions we ask in the State of Volunteer surveys, we find that this has quite stark regional differences. And partly it corresponds to the representation of volunteers from diverse backgrounds within the organization. And so this is something we're keen to understand better going forward. Different people have different conceptions of volunteering. So we know from our work on mahi aroha and Māori conceptions of volunteering that people have different concepts of what it is to do good or to help others and family. And what's interesting is whether this differs across the region. So when we look at what volunteering means in a large urban centre, does this change when we're in a small village or a small rural farming community? And one thing that would be helpful for us to explore in the future is how people conceptualize what it means to volunteer and help others within different regions of New Zealand, and how, I guess, the everyday reality shapes the kind of things they would consider volunteering. I think one aspect that's really interesting, which is around the turnover and recruitment rates, is understanding better why people join or leave an organization and whether this changes depending on the region. So we find in anecdotal evidence that a lot of rural volunteers stay for much longer in the organization than urban volunteers. And it'll be interesting to understand the full motivations for why this is so. And so I think in future work, this is something we're interested in doing. And finally, the data that we collect is only as good as what people respond to. And so the report can only be as good as the breadth of data that we collect. And so we would hope to institute the kind of strategy to collect data from the regions on a regular basis. And the hope is that we can have a regional report supplement or even integrated within the state of volunteering every time we publish the survey and the report. And this will hopefully mean that both volunteer centres and the sector has a better advocacy tool when they approach funders, when they approach central government, to be able to come up with the reasons why they might need particular support. So, for example, if you're a region with lower rates of diverse volunteer inclusion, or you're a region with higher turnover rates, you may be able to approach funding agencies for strategies and and options to help you with this. And having the data to back that up and that need is obviously a very powerful, very powerful rationale for that funder to take that need seriously. But yeah, so the report is available online. I've left the link here. You can also just Google the State of Volunteering Regional Report, which is on the Volunteering New Zealand website. And in the meantime, I'm also happy to share my contact details. So if anyone has any questions, including more detailed questions, I'd be very happy to respond to you personally by email, which is on the screen. Of course, we've got a Q&A discussion, but if you have anything further after that, or you have something particularly specific you want to ask, then do please feel free to drop me a line. So I'll end there for now, and hand over back to Marg and Michelle to brief what we're going to do next.
Just to kick things off, we were talking a bit about the data for different regions, and that is something we're going to look into a bit more, Johann, for next year.
Yeah, so I think I think there was a question about the Bay of Plenty and the Waikato region. I think so one of the challenges we had was some regions had very low response rates, and there's a sort of balance between wanting to be able to draw conclusions but not generalize based on responses that were too little. And so basically, if you're from the Bay of Plenty, please encourage your members to do more of the survey. Similarly, from the West Coast, we had just enough. But yeah, so in general, if the more people we have that respond from across Aotearoa, the easier it is for us to draw these conclusions. So that's I guess the message and the plea. But on the other hand, we've also drawn on some of the stats.
I'm just sorry to interrupt. We will be sending out the other surveys quite soon, so have it on your radar to get in and support and share with your members. Aroha mai, go.
Yeah, no, so we've also updated the new regions, and so the regions are going to correspond to the Stats NZ Regional Council distribution this time. So it allows us to better compare. So basically, I inherited this project from a legacy researcher who used her own categorization, which has its uses because we can compare the previous iterations of the survey, but it makes it harder to compare to the Stats NZ data standards. And so from this year onwards, I'm going to be promoting the Stats NZ data standards, and that means we can make quite direct comparisons between the kind of survey respondents, directly to the general population and how the regions are reflected. There are some implications. So, for example, Stewart Island under Stats NZ is part of Southland, and so we lose some specificity in that area. But I think overall it gives us a bit more comparability with the existing data that we have as well. The survey is going to be distributed through our usual channels, and I think Michelle's given a response to that.
I'm happy to share to that one. It's on our website. We do a lot of comms. We do marketing through Facebook to get as big a response as possible. I was just actually going to speak. One of the questions that came up in the group, one of the groups I joined, was around the definition of a volunteer and whether Stats NZ how it defines volunteering, and it's more about volunteer activity. And I think there was a query about whether it can cover informal volunteering, if you wanted to speak to that point.
Sure. Yeah. So informal volunteering is a very tough area because it's only defined as work done for someone outside your household without pay and for the purpose of I guess goodwill would be one very simplified way of defining it. And that means, for example, that if you're helping your mum do the gardening, that would not be volunteering because it's within the same household. But helping your neighbor mow her lawn may be volunteering. But that has a lot of implications, and we know, for example, that when we look at mahi aroha and Maori with very extended whānau, it's not very clear where the line of household is actually drawn, right? So if they're from the same marae or the same neighborhood, is that part of a household? How do you define household? And so it has a kind of very, in a way, a Western view of what a household is, and that has implications for how we define volunteers. We haven't interrogated that definition. We've presented it as Stats NZ has, but it's definitely an area where we've got some work actually conceptualizing the kind of contours of volunteering, different cultural views of volunteering. Also, some people don't consider helping another person volunteering, right? For them, it's just, oh, I'm just doing it to help them, and they wouldn't even say, oh, I'm just being nice. So, I mean, I think we're all in a way guilty of this. When we go and help someone, we don't say, oh, let's log our volunteering hours, right? Often it's just something we do. It's a habit. And similarly, there's a bit of vagueness around, for example, coaching a sports team. If you're doing that because your child's on the team, does that count as volunteering? So on most definitions, yes. Some people would not say it counts. If you attend church, is that volunteering? On the definition, no. But then some people also consider that volunteering, and as part of the community. And so I think it's a very porous definition. So it's a very good question. It's slightly above our scope to question the particular definitions, partly because we're comparing with what's there. But if we could rewrite the definitions, I think it would actually be much more fine-grained than what Stats NZ has, to take into account different cultures, different cultural norms, and the fact that volunteering, how we define it, is inherently social, I think, So if I carry someone's shopping for them back home after the bus stop, is that volunteering? If I, do something in my spare time, is that volunteering? And so I think there's a lot more social context that's involved. So in short answer, it's a complex question, and we've got other work that you can look up where we try and look at the cultural dimensions of volunteering and how that differs across different contexts.
I've added a
Yeah, so Angela made a point around how the Student Volunteer Army, ask a lot of young people to log informal volunteering, and I think that may be so, but I think it still doesn't solve the problem of how a lot of people would not even log some things that they don't consider volunteering. Also, I don't know about most people, but I don't walk around carrying a notepad logging my hours of things that I do, right? So I think it's a lot of it's recollection, so I don't go, oh, I helped Michelle with her laundry, I'm going to put, half an hour on my volunteer log. I think I think the way volunteering manifests in society is quite fluid. But no, I take the point that there is a way, hopefully, that we can conceptualize those kinds of things.
I dropped a link in the chat to the Ministry of Pacific Peoples research on volunteering and unpaid work from 2021, and it clearly underscores Johann's point about stats data not capturing the nuances of giving across Aotearoa, and by their surveying and focus groups, they discovered that people from Pacific communities had 97% of them had volunteered in some way, informally or informally, by their own definitions, setting aside the complexities around defining volunteering within Pacific communities. But yeah, it's a challenge, but we have to count it somehow so we can talk about it, and hopefully someday we'll have better ways of counting it. Are there any other questions? I don't see any hands up.
Well, one thing I was just going to flag as well, I mean, this is slightly beyond the scope of this particular issue, but on this sort of conceptualization. One of the reasons you can, so when you look at the Statistics New Zealand Labour Force surveys and the Wellbeing Supplement on volunteering, one of the reasons people give for not volunteering is that they donate money instead of volunteering. And that's, I think in itself, that raises a very interesting problem, right? Because a lot of people think, oh, I'm not going to volunteer and waste my time. I'm just going to give, I'm just going to donate to this charity and get someone else to do it. So there's a sizable proportion of New Zealand, so this is from the census data, so this is across the whole of the country, who will identify the reason they don't volunteer as the fact that they prefer to give instead of volunteer. And it's quite interesting how, in a way, it makes volunteering slightly transactional, the idea that you can substitute it by giving money. But it's also an interesting way in which we can conceptualize the different forces at play. Some people think money is a kind of direct supplement or, replacement for volunteering. And I think that draws on existing views of how we feel about volunteering, that may not translate across different contexts and cultures.
I remember one of the other barriers too was that nobody asked me. So that does point to, people being much more proactive about opportunities and making simple things like if you've got a website, then a link to volunteer roles is clearly identified there. Would you agree, Johann?
Yeah, no, I think that's right. So when we ask why people don't volunteer, there's this old view that they're not coming to us, but actually it's a two-way street. Part of volunteering is being able to have a presence and being able to make it easy for people to find you and to join you. And one of the advice we always give organizations is to have an online presence, and not only an online presence, but have a presence that says, how to volunteer. Make it very clear. Have a landing page or a tab at least that says, how to volunteer. Because I think it's really important to be able to find out how to join. And I think volunteer centers have a role in this, but also organizations themselves should have a very clear strategy for how they can get volunteers engaged in that regard.
Ollie's pointed out that the way you'd ask about volunteering may elicit different responses. My understanding, Johann, is that the General Social Survey, so the population level data is actually, it's a diary you keep of activities rather than being asked, did you volunteer? It's what did you do? And then they take what did you do and classify that as voluntary work or not voluntary work. So that's probably where the bias sits, as well as perceptions of what volunteering may be. But if the survey itself is a journal or a diary kept for a period of like a snapshot of time for everything you do. So it also relies on people filling it out and having that notebook, Johann.
Yeah, no, so I think that's true. So if you look at some surveys like the GSS, General Social Survey, that's true. But I think in some other cases, like the census data, where you're asked to recollect the past 4 weeks, where it's slightly different. So but perhaps, I agree with Michelle that there are some sources that it's more accurate, perhaps. But we can't take that for granted, I guess, across all the data sources that StatsNZ uses.
The General Social Survey is the survey benchmark that flows into the Living Standards Framework dashboard to count participation rates in volunteering, which did go up the last time they published that data in 2021. But there's that sort of shift to people doing more informal activities than formal, which is probably why organisations still identify a lack of volunteers, because there might, more people are doing stuff that is classified as informal. But correct me if I've said that wrong, Johann.
No, that's an accurate way. Thank you. Angela's got posted another question on the chat, which is around how the regional report, I guess, links in with the changing demography of New Zealand, specifically with regard to aging populations, also migration and perhaps social cohesion. I think that's a very interesting point. Taking them through in turn on the aging population. I think for the past, I'm going to say 8 to 10 years, one of the main things people have pointed out in the challenges is around aging volunteers. So in the States of Volunteering 2018, 2020 and beyond, aging volunteers is a very sizable chunk of the major challenges facing volunteer organizations. And I think that poses challenges partly around turnover and around succession planning, and also around the issue of how we basically plan for the future when people have different workloads and everything. Around growing migration, VNZ did a project in 2019 around recent migrant volunteers and how that changes. And we find actually that a lot of recent migrants are very keen to be involved in volunteering, partly because it's a gateway into New Zealand culture, partly because it's a gateway into socializing and meeting other people, reasons from developing skills for employment through to language, through to culture. And so I think there's no reason to think that increased migration will decrease volunteering. We actually find that at best, it supplements the kind of volunteering landscape. But also we have some evidence that there's actually quite high rates of volunteering among recent migrant populations. And I would just caution, I think also different cultures have different views of volunteering. So a lot of perhaps more communitarian cultures have very high rates of cultural affinity, similar to, say, Maori and Pacific peoples around how they conceptualize the extended family. And that, I think, also leads to a lot of informal volunteering. And finally, on the social cohesion, I think that's partly true around, increased atomization, perhaps. But I guess that shows that's a way we can respond differently to volunteering. So there's now a lot more online volunteering. And so I think it's not necessarily a sign that volunteering is dying. Maybe it's a sign that we should perhaps explore different ways in which we can supplement the fact that people are now perhaps busier with more entertainment, right? So there's never been more entertainment. Netflix, Disney Plus, people are saying that's one of the main causes of decreased volunteering. But on the other hand, it's an opportunity to show that we can do other things alongside and to respond, I guess, to this changing dynamic of volunteering.
That sounds like a good place to finish up at 10:28, if that's all right with everybody. Awesome. A huge thank you for joining us today. Taking an hour of your day to join us is awesome. We'll get the presentation and the recording out to you in due course. You've seen Johann's contact details, but if you want to ask us anything more, do be in touch.